Hey everyone, I'm Chris Gannon, the founder of Captivate Talent, and today I am joined by Natalie Marcotullio from Navattic. She's the head of growth operations, and we're going to talk all things PLG, SLG, which one wins, which one's the best. And we have one of the best people we know in our network to talk about it. Natalie, welcome. How are you today?
I'm doing well. Thanks so much for having me. I'm excited for this because I don't know if I'm in the camp of one is better than the other. I think there are places for both. I've been at companies that do both, so excited to share a little bit about my experience.
And that's good because then we won't get chirped in the comments about a rigorous debate on which one's better or anything like that. We can have people be happy with both sides. How about before we get into it, you just give a little bit of an intro on yourself and how you got to Novatic and into the role you're in.
Yeah, so I'm Natalie Marcotullio, head of growth at Navattic, a two-time solo marketer at startups. My last company was fully PLG, as I mentioned. So from when I started, we have a freemium offer, also had sales mixed in, so I've done like sales assist. At Navattic, we have elements of PLG. We also sell to a lot of PLG customers and a lot of companies asking us about going PLG, sometimes using even interactive demos as a form of PLG. So I just feel like there's this wide spectrum right now. Everyone's talking about it. And I've had a lot of different experiences from full blown self serve, how do we optimize that process, to fully just sales led. So, as I mentioned, happy to share some of the things I've done well and learned, and maybe some of the mistakes I've made along the way.
So maybe before we get too far into mistakes or optimizing, what are maybe just some of the core principles between product-led growth, and then we'll ask again what are some of the core principles of sales-led growth?
Yeah, I think the core principle of product led growth is how self serve it is. So, the idea that you don't need necessarily a human involved, they can get involved, but ideally you need less of a human involved, and it's way more just about the product and being able to learn and use the product on your own.
And then sales-led growth, you need a human. We need salespeople. Needs to
Pretty
push it along, right?
self-explanatory. Exactly. Yeah,
Yeah.
usually it's just human first. You're having someone lead the sales process. You can't necessarily access the product on your own. You do need that guided experience with a sales rep.
So tell me a little bit how the strategies fundamentally differ between PLG and SLG.
Yeah, this might be oversimplifying it, but I think PLG, the strategy, it really relies on a great product and that it's easy as possible to both acquire customers, get on board, and then keep them. And I'll go a little more into that. Versus sales led strategy really relies on great people. Like you need great sales reps to be able to sell the vision. You need great CS members to be able to onboard and upsell those target accounts. So I think really it boils down to just like, are you focusing on fundamentals of building a great product or building a great process with people? PLG tends to be a lot more calculated, I'd say, and much more of a volume game, a lot more about data. Like I almost see PLG a little bit like the way B2C is run, where you're basing it a lot more on large quantities of data, doing things at scale, doing small experiments to try to figure out how can we optimize the process. Where sales-led growth is much more about building those one-to-one relationships, figuring out those exact target accounts that are best fit and how to sell directly to them.
What would you say are some good examples of how a PLG strategy has been implemented effectively?
I think the gold star standard that we hear all about is like Slack, Notion, any project management, so like Asana, Monday. And I think those do so well because they have such a wide variety of use cases and can be helpful both from an individual. Like Notion does a lot of campaigning around use it for your everyday life, but can also then be upsold into like an enterprise company. I think that's when PLG companies do the best, when they can both have a large audience of those free users, but they can then use that to feed a little bit maybe of their sales motion, and also get those larger enterprise companies.
Yeah, I think it's interesting because like there's a lot of companies that all like, everyone talks about PLG, I want to be PLG, and then those companies you mentioned. I mean, I know for a fact because we've helped some of them grow their sales teams that they do hire enterprise sellers eventually, and they do build and have sales led motions eventually. Um, what about how much does product complexity and price point influence the choice between if you're going to go into a PLG motion or a sales led motion?
Just feel like I touched on that a little bit with like Notion and Slack being very individual level. But I generally say if you have a pretty simple product that can be priced, well, in theory, PLG is you have a free or freemium, so it can be priced pretty low, but generally on the lower side, that can gradually build up. So, for example, Slack, it's not like you can, do their free plan, but then you can upgrade for I think they probably have like middle tiers eventually till you get to that enterprise tier. Versus if you are a product that's very complex, your starting point is probably like, this is arbitrary, but let's say above like 10 to 20K, and does require more complex sales cycles because you have a lot of different features, product lines you can pull from. That's probably better for sales led. Really, it's like, could someone easily start using it and buy it on their own without need of help? Versus if it is a way more complex feature, a lot of different products, kind of difficult to figure out on your own, makes more sense for sales led.
Have you, in your experience, seen examples, whether at companies you've worked at or you've had colleagues, peers, friends work at, instances where companies have tried to force the wrong motion or go in a direction where, like, hey, maybe you're just following a trend or listen to a talk at SaaSter or something like that, and you're like, we need to do PLG, and then it just doesn't work out.
I think the biggest thing I hear, and we hear this all the time from our customers too, is people think, like, I think any product can actually implement a little bit of PLG, and I'll touch on that in a second. But what I hear the most common mistake is big companies that are more complex. So, for example, like fintech companies that you need to enter in like your credit card information or your bank account information, or need to enter in, you know, personal information to get value, or anything that involves a lot of integrations where you might need to be an admin to actually set it up and get that value. I feel like I've heard those more complex products just making their product free, like not thinking about creating a separate PLG version of their product, or maybe creating an aspect of it that's free, but just being like, okay, we're doing freemium now, we're doing a free trial now, we're opening up this entire complex product for 2 weeks for people to try. That's usually where I see it fail. Versus even if you have a super complex product, you might be able to take a little portion of it and make that free and use that as a way to get people in, but not just say like, okay, here's everything, you're going to get dropped in, just try it for 2 weeks.
Yeah, but believe it or not, we've actually seen it. Jay and I have seen it on our side in recruiting. I'd be honest enough to tell you that last year we even tried a part of our business to see if we can do a product-led type hands-off motion. And exactly what you said, we realized that there were too many complexities, and our buyer, which was a founder, needed to be walked through that journey with us, and we couldn't automate it. So we couldn't get out easy, to be honest.
And I think
Um,
I've so many, oh,
oh,
sorry.
sorry.
I was going to say,
No,
I've
no.
heard so many companies where even at my past startup, it's like they think a good onboarding experience or adding in-app guidance tools will solve it. And it's like, what if I just open it up and create this amazing onboarding experience? We tried everything from videos to in-app guidance to email workflows. But ultimately, if I look back, I think we just should have made only a subset of the product free versus the whole thing.
Yeah. Well, let me ask you. So, like, your experience with all the different types of clients you've worked with at Navattic and in the past, are there any types of products outside the couple you've named or specific types of markets that you've seen accelerate and go like, hey, you need to be a PLG product? And then on the inverse side, types of markets or industries or products that should just stay away from trying to force that PLG motion?
I mentioned this a little bit, but I really just do think like the multiple use cases. So, for example, like I think of Figma, where you can use it for so many different design use cases, or Miro, something where it is easy to pick up no matter what you're doing, and you have so many different types of users, can be helpful for PLG because then you don't necessarily need to put a sales rep on it. You can use that data to decide what are my best users, but still let everyone get successfully on it. So I think of workspace management, sometimes like some HR software, general like communication software, so like Slack, email, all that. And then on the flip side, things that don't work out, I see like cybersecurity comes to us a lot and has a lot of trouble because also for privacy concerns. Similar with like I said, financial software, and sometimes even sales and marketing tech. I think we've seen some examples where they have really strong PLG motions, but again, it's usually like when a subset of it is free versus, for example, something like, I mean, HubSpot is able to do PLG, but something like Salesforce, that tends to be more complex. You need something to set it up. You need help. Like when there are too many parts or systems to it, I feel like that's when we typically hear stay away from, or not stay away, but like don't just let the whole product be PLG.
Yeah, and I get the theory behind because we've seen some of those cybersecurity companies try to really push that PLG type motion, but it's because their cost of the sale is so expensive. Like, a really strong cybersecurity enterprise AE rep, it's 150K rep out of the gate without commission, without benefits, any of those other costs, like, yeah, I'd love to get around that cost. It'd be great. But the reality is when you're selling a 100, 200, $300,000 deal, it's really hard to do without somebody pushing that along.
And to the point of cybersecurity too, I think one thing I totally forgot to mention was also the persona you're selling into. Because ultimately that probably drives whether or not you need to go PLG or not. Like dev tooling, everyone I've heard that works in developer tooling has some sort of open source PLG motion because developers really don't want to talk to a sales rep. Versus in cybersecurity, you may want to avoid that conversation, but realistically, these are very like protective people. Obviously, they're very worried about their data and the security of it. They might not want to just enter in their private information into a free tool they haven't vetted before. So yes, I talked about like the use case of your product, but I'd also just really think about your persona and whether or not they prefer to buy self-serve or with a sales rep.
I have a persona question for you, actually, and I have what I think is a biased answer, or maybe just experience. What do you think, persona wise, is the easiest persona to get on a PLG, like from a buyer perspective? Like,
So this is almost like easiest and hardest, but I would imagine product people are really easy
okay,
because they want to try products and they're probably really good at learning new products. But on the flip side, they are also probably very judgy. So if we're thinking about just easiest to try it, I would think product people and sort of engineers, developers, like I said before, but then very hard to impress.
my answer is going to be marketers, but close. I would say those product-oriented marketers probably because they like to jump in things. They don't want to deal with a salesperson. They don't want to be sold. Maybe that's, I know Jay's listening. Maybe that's just my experience with him. Because
I think
every time I turn around, he has a new tool that he's on a freemium model for.
I think there's definitely some truth to marketers too. Especially, I think because marketers work so close to salespeople, they're like,
Yeah.
I don't want to be sold. I get the game. Please don't make me go through this motion. Like, I feel like I talk to so many marketers who are very weary of sales calls.
It's fair. That's fair. What about some in terms of you're setting out and you're looking to build your PLG strategy or shift because you've been part of a transition into a PLG strategy? What are some of those critical steps to make sure that that shift is successful?
I think the first thing you have to do, as I mentioned, is really critically evaluate like, can my product be self-serve? And you have to actually get users to self-serve use it. So one thing that I've heard companies do before is maybe you beta test first, right? Like don't do a huge public launch, beta test with a subset of maybe website traffic, or there are a lot of websites you can use right now that's all like user testing and things like that to go out and get people to try.
Yeah.
But really sit down, don't have people at your company do it, and just answer the question like, can they be successful? Ideally, you want to figure out what those aha or key value moments are. One way that I've heard some PLG experts talk about before is like what event or action gets someone to have 1 week plus retention. So figure out what are those moments that's going to get someone to be sticky, stay around, continue to use their product, and figure out right off the bat, self-serve, can people get to that aha product moment? I think it's going to be a lot less than you expect. Like that was
Yeah.
something that always shocked me, and I've heard from a lot of other PLG expert is like I think it's like 30 to 40%, no matter what you do, are always just going to be pokers who are going to like poke around. I know Andrew Kaplan coined that term, so I'm stealing that from him, but just like poke around your software and never actually do anything. But make
Yeah.
sure you can at least get some percentage to see success, can be self serve. And if you're not seeing customers be able to self serve on their own without having to ask support or requesting a call or just giving up entirely,
Yep.
that's when maybe you should first figure out like, okay, do I have to give away the whole thing? Is there a subset I can give away? Or maybe just like, how can we make this a lot more intuitive? So that's just step
What
number one.
what are that was step one. Okay, so if you can't get past step one, don't do it. But what are some of those like tools and websites that you can use to kind of beta test this? Are there any you recommend or you've worked with?
Yeah, like I said, I haven't used any. Well, actually, I've used Winter before to get feedback. So we've done like mock-ups, especially on like pricing and packaging. That was going to be like step three. But once you figured out if your product can be self-serve, if you want to figure out how much people would pay for it, I've gotten product feedback and pricing feedback from Winter. as I mentioned, I think it's called like user testing, a few of those other ones where you can go on and just like pay people and specify the exact ICP you're looking for and get
Yeah.
very real, harsh feedback about your product. If you don't want to pay, also, like I've made friends, family go through the experience. Obviously, they might not be your exact ICP, but I think you'll still learn a lot by figuring out, like asking them to do a simple task and seeing if they can do it. And then one thing my past company did that I love was every new user had to onboard and we'd like
Yep.
film the whole process, or every, sorry, not new user, every new employee would have to onboard and we fill the whole
Oh.
process. Yeah, and see like, okay, did they figure this out? Where did they get stuck? Because they're not as familiar with your product as existing user or employees.
I like the family thing because I'd imagine like how many like parents or siblings for the first time trying to figure out what their child actually did for a job, and they're like, "What's this? You work on the internet?" Like trying to get mom through the onboarding process.
I remember early days at Navattic redoing the website and being like, do you understand what this thing on our website that you can click around is? Like it was our own interactive demo, but I think once they went through that, they finally started to understood what I did.
There's some people out there that are like, "Wow, I'm just trying to make sure they don't get like catfished and like financially their bank account drained." But maybe they can onboard onto Nomatic too. Uh, what about you talked about that 1 week plus window of keeping users on. Are there any other metrics that somebody should prioritize on how to measure success if a PLG strategy is working?
I think the number one most important metric to look at is just like activation. So, as I mentioned,
Yeah.
30% of users are probably going to just be pokers, do nothing. I've heard healthy activation numbers from anywhere between like 20 to 50%. Go double check me on that. But generally, you want to make sure that a certain number of cohort of your users are being successful, are actually getting to those aha moments. But on top of just activation, time to value. So making sure they're getting to that in a reasonable time. That's always going to differ depending on your product. So if you have, again, a more complex product that maybe takes a little more setup, it might take longer time to value. If you're something like again, Figma and the first time to value is just creating a really simple design, or if it's Slack, even simpler, and your first time to value is just sending a message, that can be relatively quick. And then also looking at conversion to paid. If you don't have good
Yeah,
activation
yeah.
and good time to value, you're not going to get anyone to paid. So you have to figure out those metrics first. But ultimately, see around, I've heard anywhere between like 2 to 7% for conversion to paid. So also, expectation setting, more than 90% will probably not pay you for a freemium or free trial.
Yep. Now, shifting kind of, out of that freemium free trial kind of mindset, what are some key elements of a strong sales-led growth strategy from your perspective?
I think almost the like, if PLG is based so much on scalability, how do we make sure anyone can get into the product, sign up, and do it without needing to talk to anyone? I see a really strong sales process as a little bit of the opposite, where you can create really like very tailored custom experiences. So everyone who goes through it should feel like, okay, this is for me. They are selling to my specific persona. If
Yeah.
you have a target account list, it should feel like I'm speaking exactly to those target accounts, those ICPs. And I think you can measure that through your sales cycle win rate and just like sales cycle time and conversion rates. Like if you are, know your ICP very clearly, know the messaging that resonates with them,
Yep.
and then knows the sales process that they enjoy, generally you will have a higher win rate. And on the flip side, that prospect is going to feel like, again, oh my gosh, this product was made custom for me. They anticipated my questions. They knew exactly what I was going to ask.
Where do you think I'll share what my thoughts are on this because I hear it debated sometimes. Where do you think the price point has to be from a yearly contract for you to say, hey, we're okay with this being a sales-led motion. We could put a human or two behind this, or hey, we have to either we figure this out as a PLG motion or we're dead in the water.
I said like 10 to 20K
Yeah.
before.
Yep.
That's what I typically see. Like, and maybe if your price point starts, I'd say at 10 to 20K, that's probably when sales led makes a little more sense. Again, I have seen a lot of sales led companies though who might offer a free tool or a free part of their product or do something like an interactive demo where you can play around with the product in some way. So I think you can also introduce elements of PLG if you're still a larger price point, but generally probably hard to have a full PLG motion if you're like 10 to 20K.
Yeah, and I think so many. I just remember myself earlier in the year. I was on like three demos with the company, and it was like I did the math. It was like 4 grand a year, and I was like, how do we have a person that has enough time to give me 3 demos on this type of product? Like it just the math you're just going to break. And I get it if you're like building a product and you really need that customer feedback, which actually is kind of part of my next question. How do you make sure you get the right customer feedback in a sales-led growth effort? And how does that differ from, you mentioned it a little bit before, a PLG motion?
Like in sales led, it's all about like qualitative data. And in PLG, it's all about quantitative data. Like in PLG, you have the volume where you can run like statistical studies to see, okay, what feature means that someone's 5x more likely to convert. Like you can, or you can look at all your different users and say, okay, I see that this title and this company size has a 3x more likely to convert or hit my activation metric than this one. That should be your ICP. On the flip side, sales led, you don't have usually that volume to you maybe have
Yeah.
some level where you can do some analyses, but not anything like statistically significant. So really rely more on those sales insights. Like I'm such a believer as a marketer to get most of my insights from the sales team, from the CS team, listening to their calls. And then again, honestly, just asking. I think the simplest way is to just ask your reps what their favorite leads are, and you'll figure out who is your best ICP, who do we relate to, what's some of the best messaging for them. And then flip side on customer CS, ask them who are their favorite customers, who are the healthiest, who activate. Time and time again, I've done like ICP exercises and laid out all of our top customers, looked like what they had in common. And it was pretty similar to just the customers that sales and CS liked.
As someone who's in charge of that growth function at your company, how important, especially in your earlier days, is it to have a rep or a CSM that has that relationship like with marketing and product? Like I feel like that's missed so often and people just optimize for industry or ICP experience. Like have you had that person like in your team before? And like how helpful has that person been?
Someone who provides insights or someone who's like worked in the
Some
industry their customer has.
yeah, like a no, like a salesperson that's just not like understands maybe why they lost a deal or why they want a deal from a product standpoint or from a marketing standpoint. Like we see that characteristic missed so many times on early stage hiring.
Honestly, I'm very lucky at Navattic. I'd say almost everyone here is very good at insight sharing. Like we're a very reflective company where if we do lose or if we are winning, trying to figure out like why is this industry better than this or this lead source? So almost every rep in TSM I've talked to has been pretty good at that. I think it also takes a little bit of like you have to have a little bit of humility to be okay with it because you have to admit like hey
Yeah.
I didn't win that deal and maybe it's because of these other factors but you have to be a little bit okay with talking about also losses or churn or closed one. And I think so often at a small startup we feel like our roles are so important, we're being judged so hard, so that's why people don't necessarily want to share those learnings because you're not just sharing what's going well, you have to share what's going wrong.
I'm assuming that's a top-down culture kind of mindset. It's not
Yeah.
just coming from people that you innately hire and you just get lucky, right?
Yeah, we were pretty big just in general about insight sharing. And then even every
Uh,
quarter, we do a last quarter of Attic and we shared like what went well and then what didn't go well and what are some learnings. And we're very just big also of framing it as learnings versus like failures and treating learnings as a win versus like even if something
this is
didn't
why
work
we
out,
lost.
yeah, what did we get at? What did we
Yeah.
learn from it?
No, that's amazing. It's like here's what we learned and how we go forward versus this is an L. You don't always have to count it as an L. It can be this is how we advance. What about, you mentioned Monday.com before, and we know them really well, and it's funny when people still say PLG because I think of them as a company that we help scale their enterprise team for. Because that's when we came into work with them. And obviously they were very much a PLG driven company and still are today. But what are some of the benefits and challenges when you're going towards that hybrid growth strategy? Because you've been in a company that was all PLG, but then you've also been in a company that was SLG and shifted to opening up a PLG motion. Like, what are some of the things you have to watch out for when you're kind of crossing that other bridge and still trying to do your original motion?
Few benefits. One, I talked about that qualitative and quantitative data. Now you have both. Now you can marry the data you're seeing, but you're like, oh, I
Yeah.
still don't fully get it. And you can ask the sales reps, like, we're doing that a lot right now. It's like we see data, and then you can go into the sales reps meeting, and be like, oh, that's why users are stuck, or that's why they're upgrading. Like, for example, we heard a lot of our if they did try like a free trial or freemium experience, if they saw customer examples, that was a really helpful moment for them to
Yep.
activate. So then we incorporated a little call out in the product that says, see customer examples. Things like that, where you can get you can often get from the quantitative data, like what is wrong or what is working, but from the qualitative, you can really dive into why. I think on the flip side, challenges like that only works if you're working closely with your sales team. What I
Yep.
often see is PLG versus SLG becomes a fight for attribution. And then
Yeah.
sales is like, oh my gosh, this PLG motion is going to come in and take all my leads, and I'm not going to have leads anymore, and the product's going to sell. And then product is thinking, I don't want sales reps attacking my users and going after them and outbounding them immediately. That's not going to be a good experience. And I want credit for my users upselling. So I really think leadership has to think about like how can you make this a shared metric, or how can you put in guidelines around when sales can reach out or when product can count something to make sure it isn't just fighting over attribution. And then sales are trying to go around product and not listening to what they suggest, and product is trying to make it so sales can't get any leads. I've just seen a lot of contention happen with PLG.
You know what? You're so right. And I think most of the time it's, we're human, and humans innately just want to protect themselves. So people aren't nefarious in the way they're thinking. It's just more of like, I don't want to, if you're the head of sales development, you're like, well, there goes my whole SDR team if something like that happens. And I remember a company I was working at, I was their head of talent, and the head of strategy came over to me one day and said, our price point's too low. It was like $199 a month. And I was building this massive SMB team for them, from a recruiting perspective. She's like, we should just double down on marketing and make this a PLG motion. And in my head, I was like, well, that means I'm out of a job because we're hiring 25 reps a month. So yeah, you're right. That's the first thing that came to my mind, is like resources and like, where do I go and what happens to me? So good call out there. Well, what else can companies do to successfully layer in? And Jay called it this, so I don't know if this is a term, product-led sales or PLS. We have too many PLs or SLs going around now.
Yeah, I've heard product led sales. I've heard sales assist as another way to describe it. What I see work really well is when you, again, work together with sales to figure out like when
Yep.
is an appropriate time to reach out to someone? What are touch points that make sense? So, for example, at my past company, we had free trialers, and at some point we just had BDRs reaching out to every free trialer who signed up. And those turned into support calls. This was really frustrating on both ends. For the rep, they didn't want to
Yeah.
be answering support calls. And for the end user, obviously our sales reps aren't as trained as our support team, so they didn't always get their questions answered. And they were like, well, someone's reaching out to me. Why would you reach out to me and not help me? So I think being really intentional about like the leads you sell. I've heard PQLs is what it's called, product qualified leads, the leads you send to sales from your freemium or free trial experience. We use a lot of like intent signals. So did they hit our
Mm.
activation moment? Did they view our pricing page? Have they added new
Yeah.
users? All those things to maybe flag like, hey, this is someone who is successful. So they're not just going to have a lot of support questions, and they're clearly excited. This is a good person to send to sales to more talk to them about new use cases, how they could expand, all that, versus sales just reaching out and being like, hey, I saw you signed up, want to jump on a call? And then again, that call turns into support call.
Yeah. And I'm sure you have to have like a time in there too. Like, every user that signs up for a freemium, if they're just getting hit with a sales call 3 days later, like, maybe 2 weeks later or something like that, or whatever makes sense for that product. But I'd find that, every time you sign up for Canva, if you get a phone call or Figma, then boom, a rep reaches out to you 2 days later, you probably haven't even had time to finish whatever project you wanted to work on. Okay. Any insights or experience in your career where that hybrid approach has become really successful?
This is a lot more of a long-term game, but I've seen, as far as like lead source, like I've seen a lot of times, again, if you get a power user who comes in, is really successful in the free experience, nurture them with sales, then maybe use that as like an outbound signal too. I think the problem with the strategy, everyone thinks like, okay, I'll see one person who signs up from a large enterprise. I'm going to outbound 20 people else from their company. And of course, they're going to want to sign up because this one rep signed up. Not necessarily that, but when you start seeing handfuls of people signing up, and I know this was a strategy that Slack deployed, like they try to get multiple users within an organization to use their free
Yep.
product. And then once you have that, trying to maybe outbound higher up execs at the company and saying like, hey, everyone's using our product anyways. Or better yet, what we saw a lot at my past company is it just happened organically. managers would just hear, hey, a lot of people, like a lot of my reps are liking this tool. Maybe I should try it out and actually
Of
do like
course.
actually take a demo of it.
Yeah, I've been on some demos because all of a sudden three of my team members are using something and they really like it, and I had no idea that it was even happening, and then boom, we're on a demo call. What about I have a question for you. Do you think PLG got a little overhyped to the point where companies were trying to force the motion a little bit over the last few years?
Definitely. And I think, as I talked about before, that was that. Why don't we just introduce a free trial, slap it on our website, now just say the product's open for 2 weeks? I mean, it's like any strategy, right? It's like, it's the same reason why you hear everyone saying outbound doesn't work. Outbound doesn't work if you just hire 10 reps, give them an email automation platform, and they then say, like, hey, go after people. It You need to think about the strategy behind it. You need to often get leadership on board. As I mentioned, change the metrics and incentives so there's not infighting about it and attribution. You need to set up processes so you're not just sending every lead their way that's a bad fit. So I think it got really trendy. And then because we're all strapped for time and busy and there's not necessarily a playbook, and oftentimes leadership was like, okay, you have 1 month to implement PLG. People did the fastest thing they could without really getting, especially getting like a company-wide buy-in for it and changing processes. Like that's where I see it failed. Like expecting the old sales-led processes to work, as I mentioned, calling every
Yep.
single free trialer with the new PLG motion.
It's tough because I think people go to these conferences or they see these webinars or they listen to things like this and they hear one thing, and like the amount of times it's been like, oh, we should just be PLG, or we should just every new feature that we roll out, we should just charge for. Or the other one was outbound, like, oh, we get early stage founders that are like, we need more demand, we're going to hire a sales rep. I'm like, whoa, like you don't have any product market fit, and you think a 23-year-old SDR in the middle of the country that you're going to pay under market value is going to be your savior for demand. Like you have to think more fluidly on like, do these apply to my product in my world? Um, Speaking of influence and stuff like this, have you seen what signals and factors should somebody look for to shift or to make that shift from PLG to SLG or vice versa? Like when is it time where maybe you should pay attention to the blogs and the talks at SaaStr or whatever it might be?
I'd say so. If you're PLG and debating incorporating in a sales-led motion, funny enough, I've heard this from a few PLG experts. Like, start listening to people ask for demos or ask to talk to someone. Like, you might be surprised that, especially if it is someone who's higher up who doesn't want to go through the effort of setting up a free trial, they might start reaching out, asking if there's a way to get in touch. Or if you just start noticing more enterprise users come in, maybe again, multiple users at specific accounts, and if they seem to have struggle upselling or figuring it out on their own. I mean, there are very few companies. I think about like Atlassian, who is fully PLG forever, but often that's not the case. Eventually, people, if it is a more complex product, if you introduce multiple product lines, if it does get more expensive, they probably want to talk to someone. On the flip
And
side, if you are sales led and you're thinking about when to incorporate PLG, just start paying attention to like, again, are you hearing the opposite? Are you hearing a bunch of your users requesting, like, can I just get started? Can I just sign up? Is there an easy way to get access? Maybe if you find out that like they're going with a competitor who's PLG and they're
yep,
just getting started with them faster. And I think especially as your product develops and if you do notice new users can get up and get onboarded faster, even just in like your sales led
yep.
motion, if it's not taking as much time to see that value, those are good signals that you might be ready for PLG.
It's like if you get somebody who when they get on the phone with a sales rep, just like send me to the credit card. Here's my credit card info. Like maybe it's time to switch. And then like if your chatbot on your PLG page keeps getting like, can I talk to somebody? Like you should probably think about bringing somebody in.
Yeah, those are
So
perfect examples. I also think from a business perspective, if you're noticing your current motion maybe slowing down, like to some degree, every motion probably has its limits. Like you don't hear of many companies that just survive on outbound forever, who just survive on inbound forever. I think a PLG is the same way. Like if your current motion, you're starting to just see it plateauing a little bit. And this is advice I've heard from other PLG experts. Like the best time to go PLG is just straight at the beginning and just set the product up that way, or when you're
yep.
starting to know your see your growth plateau and you need to introduce a new motion.
Well, you've done these shifts. What do you think is harder? If do you think it's harder if the product's built in a PLG motion to switch to that sales led, or if you're a sales-led motion and then all of a sudden, hey, we want to do PLG, like what's harder from a product and a marketing standpoint to shift into?
I think this is just my opinion. I know there are plenty of people
Super,
who have
super
others.
opinion based. Yes, super opinion based question.
I actually think it might be harder to be sales led and introduce product led because often at sales led orgs, let's just be honest, sales usually has a lot of the power in the company.
Yeah, yeah.
They have a lot of say. And 9 times out of 10, unless you introduce PLG correctly and explain that if we do this right, we will get you better, more qualified leads, sales is just going to be like, oh my God, don't take away my leads. Like, don't let people not let me go through it. So I think it's a lot harder to get sales buy in
Okay.
versus PLG. I mean, it's hard because at the end, if you're really truly PLG and you're very engineering focused and product focused, and they have a lot of buy-in, they might be like, whoa, 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 why don't we want salespeople? But usually companies are like, oh, if we bring in a salesperson, we'll get bigger, cooler logos. Like usually that sounds a little more enticing than if you are sales led and
Yep.
you're like, wait, we're gonna get a bunch of free users who aren't gonna pay us.
So what you said, if we really dumb it down on the record, sales is the problem.
Maybe.
Just kidding. No, 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 no. Again, nobody's going to chirp at you in the LinkedIn comments. I promise. But no, no. That's a really good view of it. Where it's hard to even take budget. Sales takes a lot of budget up, and like it probably does mean they won't need as many headcounts from an SDR perspective, or might not go to as many events or whatever it might be, or have all these extra tools that they think are so necessary in their tech stack. But in reality, it's like we're going to get you like hyper qualified enterprise leads that are ready to buy and like have already used the product. Like you want it, you want this.
I think budget is such an important point and something I didn't touch on earlier. Another way I see PLG fails is when it doesn't get budget. Like, so often companies
Mm.
are like, okay, we're just going to go PLG, free trial, 2 weeks, bam, open, but there's no dedicated PLG engineer. So there's no one improving the onboarding experience, making sure that backend, all the data is flowing processes. Like, even we're thinking about right now, how do we make sure customers don't sign up for the PLG experience? There are small things like that that you do need engineering help for. So also if you're sales, suddenly you're like, wait, engineering is going to get more budget and maybe take that budget away from me. I could see how that's scary.
And I've heard salespeople, especially on the enterprise side, say like if there's pricing of any sort or a freemium on a website, it's not an organization they want to work at because they're always then having to counteract. They can't price accordingly. It's a real challenge that they're going to run into in the sales process. So it is challenge. It's tough. It's tricky. It's not an easy switch.
Yeah. Just know know very few people and very few companies, and I've talked to a lot of companies trying to go PLG who said like that was a delightful experience. There's going to be a little bit of a learning curve and a little bit of friction because you are fundamentally changing how the business works if you're going full blown PLG.
Natalie, on the subject, if you can just give like one or two more, whether it's takeaways, advice, something that you'd want your future self to hear, if you can go back and do it all over again, what would they be? Just one or two takeaways.
I mentioned this before, but this was such a big takeaway was like don't just view every single free trialer as a lead and don't think you can just like hand them off to sales and it'll magically work out. You need to make sure that these users are being successful, they're being activated, they're enjoying the product first before seeing success. And all the best PLG companies, I'm sure they'll say the same thing. They figured out how to get users to the aha delight moment before asking for anything. And then I think on the flip side too, like work with your sales team. Like don't just get annoyed that they're reaching out to every user or that they don't get it. Like try to work with them to figure out what users do you like, what leads do you like, what leads are working, what aren't, who should we be going after? Like don't just get frustrated at sales for not adopting to this new motion or not being open to it when it's changing everything about their day-to-day job.
Yeah, I think if you're making that switch, like if you don't have buy-in from your sales leader, like either A, you're never going to make that switch successfully, or B, you just might have the wrong leader in place and figure that one out too. You can call us maybe in that case.
Find a new leader, yeah.
Uh, Natalie, tell us a little bit real quick. Tell us a little bit about Navattic. Love to hear a quick commercial, and then where can we find you and any other resources or links we should find your stuff on, or you have a podcast, right?
Yeah. So I'll start with the Navattic pitch. We're an interactive demo company. Basically, it means that you can create like try before you buy software. So a little clickable demo. If you are thinking about going PLG, but the prospect of fully dedicating engineering resources, changing your entire process seems scary, we have seen a number of customers who will use interactive demos as a nice middle step, show your product more, but still ultimately they have to get a sales call to buy it. If you want to learn more about me or chat more about PLG, I'm still learning a lot myself, but have been lucky to talk to a few experts. I'm on LinkedIn way more than I should be. Feel free to check me out there. And then, yeah, I do have my own podcast. We are paused for the summer. It's called Revenue on the Rocks. If you want to hear about sales and marketing alignment, it's me and my head of sales talking about generally how we work, how do we get along or sometimes not get along. And it's all over a drink. So, it's an open and dialogue.
There might be a couple drinks coming your way for that podcast when it kicks back up in the spring, in the fall.
I'm looking forward to it.
So, Natalie, thank you so much for your time today. It was a pleasure, and we'll talk to you soon.
Thanks so much for having me, Chris.
All right, Jay.